We must constantly look at things in a different way.
The Healthcare Education Transformation Podcast was created by two physical therapists out of the desire to learn more about the different educational roles in physical therapy and healthcare, and how healthcare education works by talking with educational leaders and people with different perspectives within physical therapy and across interdisciplinary lines on how education can be improved to disrupt the status quo of healthcare education. This is our journey, and thanks for listening. Are you a third-year physical therapy student that excels on tests when you have study guides, checklists, and deadlines? With all of the information available about how to prepare for the NPTE, it's easy to get disorganized and not feel prepared going into the big day. NPTE Prep Success is an online course that provides PT students easy-to-use study guides and step-by-step guidance through the NPTE preparation. To learn more, visit kylericeprep.com. Thank you again all for your continued support. And now for the show. Hey, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Healthcare Education Transformation Podcast. My name is Brandon Pollen, and I am one of your hosts. And of course, as always, I'm joined by my fellow co-host, F. Scott Fiel. And today we're really excited to welcome two very special guests on to talk about the published numbers regarding DPT program expenses and revenues. Now, for this episode, we are happy to welcome Joe Ranke, who is the CEO and founder of FitBunks Inc., and Alan Fredenal, who is the COO of the Institute of Clinical Excellence and physical therapist at Perry Physical Therapy in Perry, Michigan. Now, for those of you who aren't aware, Alan worked on a research project in which Joe Ranke helped him obtain the data in the public domain regarding the costs and revenues of U.S. DPT programs, and we're really excited to dive into this topic. Now, I know some of our listeners are probably listening right now, and they're like, wait a second, didn't you have Joe on in the past? And the answer is yes, we did some time ago, because at that time, Joe came on to talk about just overall student loan debt and some strategies that students and clinicians can do to really contribute to reducing their debt. So please feel free to check out the show notes for that if you missed that episode. But, gentlemen, thank you both so much for your time and for your service that all of you guys have done to help advance the profession. And I really respect what you guys both have done. I recognize that there are some of our listeners out there that perhaps haven't heard of you guys. Would you mind giving our listeners some background into who you each are, along with your academic journeys that led you to where you're at now? And Alan, how about if we start with you for this one?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, guys. Appreciate being here. I am a practicing physical therapist in Michigan, a CrossFit coach, and in addition to all that, I help run the Institute of Clinical Excellence, so I help run all of the logistics and back end for ICE.
Very nice. Joe, how about you? Give us a little refresher on who you are.
Yeah, so I am definitely not a PT. My wife's the PT. I let her do all that stuff. I'm the finance guy. I've been in finance for a long time now, over 20 years. And I created this technology that helps just, financial plan and make everything easy to understand. And we decided to roll it out. We're trying to figure out student loan plans first, and specifically in PTs. So we rolled out the first full version of it last September. And as of today, we have about 4,500 PTs that we've helped, both students and new grads, manage about $600 million of student loan debt. So we've been able to collect a lot of data over the last year and a half, and using that data for a lot of good things, a lot of good feedback to the programs and all that fun stuff. So that's a little bit of my background and, my company FitBunks in the PT world, and that's how we are in PT.
Awesome, Joe. Well, with you coming on the podcast last year to talk on student loan debt, could you maybe give us an update before we dive into the DPT program finance data? What were the latest numbers and trends on student loan debt in the U.S., and are there any new changes that are looking to take place to address the student loan debt problem on a macro or a micro level?
So, I'll go from the bottom up on that, basically in the PT world, and then go to the broader spectrum. In general, the PT for DPTs, we see about $139,000 in debt on average on our platform. Again, that's 4,500 new grads that we have. From a macro level, everybody's like, well, is that a problem with DPTs? It's actually just on the graduate level in general that we see that across the board. When you look at ratios, they're pretty consistent across the board of how much people have borrow versus relative incomes. And that's continuing to have a bigger and bigger gap. On the macro level, is anything going to be done? I don't see it anytime in the near future. I'm sure we'll talk about the Prosper Act, but that is so far down on the totem pole of, student loans in general, so far down on the totem pole of what anybody's even talking about in Congress that, I just don't see anything happening except for if, I guess you can call them pre-grad students stop going to grad school. That's to me, what you're actually seeing right now. So I've actually heard that quite a bit from chairs, from different programs, from just programs, MBA students, everybody across the board, just schools coming to me saying, we need help? And it's like, well, why? What's going on? They're like, we're starting to lose applicants because of this stuff. So from a macro level, that's the part that I'm starting to see. And then from the micro level, the dollar amount's about $139,000 for PTs. That's what we see. So, and go from there.
Yeah, Joe, you mentioned it briefly here, but for our listeners who are not aware, could you maybe tell them what the Prosper Act is and what the current status of that act is?
Yeah, so there's actually a couple things that started being talked about last year. So the Prosper Act was put forth by the House of Representatives in December of last year. Basically what it did was do away with public service loan forgiveness. The whole point was to potentially repeal it and then replace it with something else. And so that was put out first. And part of it was also to streamline all these income-driven repayment plans. So right now there's 5 different repayment options for income-driven plans. And there's, I think, 3 different or 4 different options for pay down strategy. So there's actually like 8 or 9 different repayment plans. So the goal was to streamline that to just 2. And so they put that plan out. And then President Trump put one out that was pretty similar, had some differences on who would qualify, who would be grandfathered in, all these different things. Long story short, neither one of them went anywhere. I don't even think they ever brought to a vote. And like I said, it's not on the radar for a lot of them because it's not a major pressing issue, which I'm actually shocked because, everybody's trying to get the vote of the younger generation, yet neither side really talks about it. But that's where we're at right now with that, is they've kind of just stagnated and they're not really going anywhere.
So Joe, I'm curious here, just because, obviously going off that a little bit, kind of going into the act here. So hypothetically, if that did pass, would that mean a big significant change in terms of college tuition and stuff like that? Or would it not be a huge change?
Well, one of the things it would do is, and this was part of President Trump's, is a lot of people for graduate school, they blame the run up of tuition prices on a bill that was passed. I believe it was in 2010 or 2012. I can't remember what year. But President Obama basically uncapped how much you could get for federal loans for grad school. And I can't really say he uncapped it because you can still only borrow up to what's called the certified amount. So each school has to certify how much their programs cost, and then that's how much in federal loans you can get for the students. The issue is that the schools, they can kind of just keep upping how much that certification is, and that's what they've done. So you've seen tuition really go through the roof for grad schools the last probably 6 to 8 years because of that. So one of the big things that the Prosper Act does, I can't remember if it was a Prosper Act or if it was President Trump's, it put a cap back on how much you could get for federal loans. And so trying to basically put pressure on the schools to say, look, stop raising prices. But then obviously the other side then starts going back saying, oh, well, that means that people are just going to go out and get private loans, and private loans are higher interest rates than federal loans. So that's, the issue there is trying to fight back and forth of what would be the ramification on if they actually capped it or not. And again, we'll see where that goes. I don't really see it going anywhere. But there was one other thing too. I forgot to throw this in there because this was actually pretty significant. And I don't know if you guys have seen this. Have you seen that they actually passed the IRS in a letter ruling for 401k contributions and matching for student loans? Have you guys seen that?
Right, I heard about that. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think it's going to be actually pretty significant. What it does is the IRS now allows companies that if you were to say your company has like a 3% match into their 401k, like you put in the money to their 401k and they match it, instead of you having to put the money into their 401k, they can match your student loan payment instead. So you can actually pay down your loans and still get your match without having to contribute to the 401k. So from a financial standpoint, to me, that's huge.
Yeah, I'd have a heck of a 401k at this point.
So that's what I'm hoping. I hope that a lot of companies will institute that. I know we're working with a company to use some of our technology as part of their solution for that. And if companies more and more start embracing that, I think that could be very significant in terms of just overall saving, because that's the big thing right now with student loans is I got to pay all this stuff down. That makes it so I can't save. But if companies start instituting this piece and taking advantage of that, well, then it's like, okay, well, that helps alleviate the issue of not being able to save while paying off your loans. So hoping that gets more runway and more run over the next 2 to 3 years. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah, no, that's really, really interesting. And Joe, this is the next question I'm going to ask is kind of a big one here. And I know that there's a lot of things to this, and I know this is not an easy answer, but just to kind of get an understanding of the university perspective from their financial side, because obviously when we look at the tuition rates, I mean, when we look at just inflation with everything, I mean, tuition for colleges has just been skyrocketing huge compared to so many other things.
Yep.
So just to kind of get some understanding on, why it's so high, do you know kind of how, generally speaking, the financial structure is of universities is, to give some context?
I can't go into the individual ones because each school is different, especially if it's for-profit versus nonprofit. I used to, back when I was in college, I was director of baseball operations for our program and at a public school. So I dealt a lot with the finances, trying to deal with that side of it, financial aid, everything. And I mean, it was a fight for money left and right because our baseball program was actually the only program that was profitable in the entire school. And so when it came to just tuition, I mean, every program was in the red. A lot of it had to do with tenured teachers not actually teaching, all that type of stuff. I mean, there's a number of factors that come into that. So for a lot of public schools, even though it's like, yeah, we're not making that much money, it's like, that's the big thing that I hate is basically graduate programs and graduate students are funding and paying for undergrad students. And what I mean by that, for example, it's like interest rates on your loans are based on risk. So like mortgages, car loans, it's all based on risk, more risk, higher interest rate. And so we got this ass backwards in the student loan industry for federal loans. Graduate students, so DPTs, MBAs, are less risk for repaying their student loans, yet their interest rates are double of what an undergrad interest rate is. Basically, the government's using the grad school students to subsidize the undergrad, and it makes no sense whatsoever. And nobody ever brings that up. And it's like, that's a place that we can attack a lot because the grad students are the ones with the highest loans, like the most loans, accruing all this interest. So why is it at 6? I mean, the new grad plus loans are at 7.6%. Why? It makes no sense. So that's what we see on the public school side. Then on the private school side, I mean, they're private schools, so they're a business. You have to have a margin. So typically we see, private schools, just from what I've heard, trying to get anywhere between a 20 and 35% margin, which is not, a huge amount, but I mean, that's, the typical amount. So that's what they're basing their pricing on, is that margin. And as costs go up to employ people and whatever it is, depending on what state they're in, then that can get ran up as well. So, but that's just it. Again, the tough question, because it really just depends on the state that they're in, the type of setting they're in, what type of school they are. It all influences that number of what they're shooting for.
Yeah, for sure. So guys, let's dive right into the nuts and bolts of this episode here. One of the main concerns has been the growing number of PT programs across the country. And one of the concerns is that, in addition to not having an appropriate number of quality faculty to fill those roles, is, the less amount of federal funds per program, with more programs coming year after year. And, Jim Gordon kind of called for this in his Macmillan lecture, that possibly we need to look at programs being consolidated and having less programs in the future. What are your guys' thoughts on this? And Alan, I'd love to hear yours first.
I've not listened to that lecture, so I can't speak to that lecture specifically. I do know that as we increase the number of programs, we're just going to see an increase in supply of PTs and just kind of basic supply and demand. As supply goes up, demand is going to go down. There's some research out of Arizona that we might see an increase in PT unemployment, which is kind of unheard of in our profession. So we might see an increase in PT unemployment in the 2020s, which of course is going to affect this whole thing. If you can't get a job, it's going to be tough to pay back those loans.
It's actually interesting that, two primary thoughts on that. I've actually, within our algorithm, when we don't release this publicly, but we ranked every program in the country. And some of the data that we collect continually feeds into our algorithms to update different things. And I've talked to quite a number of chairs, and they have asked me to start doing some type of surveys and polls of employers saying, is there any correlation between employment and some of the schools? Because like you said, it's getting diluted with some of the different schools. So is there any way we can start ranking that information to start adding that into the rankings and potentially then publish them? So we have been starting to look into how can we collect that data to make it relevant and all that type of stuff. But just from a pure economic standpoint, I mean, like, Alan was just talking about, there's a give and take on that too. So like if you have, too many programs and too much supply, then, demand stays about the same. And all of a sudden you're flooding the market, you got unemployment that also puts pressure on incomes. And it's like, okay, well, you start flooding the market. But then on the flip side of that, it's like, okay, well, if you also limit how many schools there are, then you limit the supply of PTs, which is great because you might have some income going up. But you also start saying from the school standpoint, okay, well, we have limited seats and demand is still where it's at. Well, now tuition prices just went up because the demand's there. So there's this trade-off, and what's that equal balance? That's the big question mark, is what is that balance? And, unemployment for PTs is pretty low. I'd still go out if I was the industry and still focus on saying, how can we get paid more? Like just in general. And that would be the primary focus I think everybody should be focusing on. But there's that give and take. It's like, okay, well, if we do it over here, what's the effect of over there? And so when we're talking about tuition prices, what would that do to tuition? Because less spots, you got demand still, what are you going to do with pricing on that? So you have to look at both sides of the coin, and it's a lot of research to try to come up with the right answer that unfortunately I can't do all that research. So
Yeah,
I'll leave that one to you guys.
No, and it was really interesting. We had Lori Hack on the show not too long ago, and one of the things that she said that we really need a lot more research on is about our workforce. Then the key is, are we making this decision out of true assessment of the workplace, or is it kind of what other people have said throughout the podcast? Is it just more for financial benefit for the institution to make up for the other margins,
Yep, exactly.
We've talked about the debt to where it's at now and a couple other things, and I'd like to switch gears to talk about specifically the DPT program finance data. Now, Alan, first and foremost, what specifically made you decide to research this topic?
I started this topic when I was in PT school still. We had a group assignment to dig deeper into student loans and student loan data and that sort of thing. And I'm out of breath because I'm spinning on my bike right now. That's why I sound like hyperventilating. To dig deeper into student loan debt, and we decided, instead of kind of just using general sources, to kind of do some research of our own, dig a little bit deeper, look into not only at our own program, what is kind of the cost, what is the average student debt of our class, but to kind of try and expand it and go nationwide with it and get a bigger picture of what's going on.
Yeah. And Alan, what were your methods for collecting and synthesizing this data?
So we tried to start with every program, but we realized quickly that the private programs weren't interested in participating, and that they also don't publish any of their financial data. So we scratched those off the list and just stuck with public programs. And from there, with the public programs, we created a list of every program and their director, and emailed those directors and told them what we were doing and asked for their help. And from there, we got some response. We got some yeses, some nos, mostly got ignored. And from the ones that we did get their data, we plugged that into a spreadsheet. And then from there, we dug deeper program by program, either using some of the data that Joe gave us that he already had, or looking into the financials, which most public institutions in most states have to publish that. There are some weird states like Pennsylvania where the colleges are public-private hybrids and they don't have to share that. But looking as deep as we could, pulling out how much salary the faculty get paid, trying to find as much on the costs as we can, and from there kind of crunching a revenue minus cost number. Not that number, like Joe said, is pure profit in sort of a traditional corporation sense, but that's kind of what's left over. What the university does with that is kind of usually out of the hands of the department, the PT department, and up to the university. And most universities weren't willing to share where that money went, but like Joe said, the graduate programs at most places subsidize a lot of the undergraduate programs that are either overstaffed or underattended or both. So that's kind of from start to finish how we collected that data, and then we threw it into one big spreadsheet and presented it.
Yeah, and Alan, you bring up a pretty good point there. A lot of times right even down to the cost of tuition for a DPT program is not even owned and controlled by the DPT department. It's much higher up. Todd Davenport was talking about this on his episode a couple weeks ago. How realistically, a lot of times the DPT programs are at the mercy of, say, somebody much higher up the chain at the university. And on top of that, Janet Besner was on the show, and one of her thoughts and ideas on how to make things better was to possibly have PT schools becoming their own school. Mm-hmm. This way that they're taking control of everything from cost down to the way they want to run it, down to where those funds are allocated and where they end up going. So the physical therapy school would be its own school as opposed to, a state university with a DPT program.
Yep. And that would be a huge thing. It's actually one of the things I talk to my wife about a lot, because a lot of people ask me, can you think of any alternative measure? And the one I keep going back to is standalone PT schools. And then what you would do is, because I could touch on this too, is a lot of the problem is not necessarily the PT tuition. It's the undergrad and the cost of living that adds up. And so it's like, okay, well, if you look at that and that individual standalone PT school, if they partner with like a community college to do like the AA and the undergrad piece. And so basically you go from there, maybe do like a semester or a year at a regular grad school to get your your bachelor's, but you do most of it at a community college, and you have that partnership going, and they go straight into PT school. You just trim down the cost a lot. So yeah, I definitely stand by that one, because that would be huge. It's just how do you get accredited and all that stuff. There's a lot of what ifs in that model, but it's something that should definitely be explored.
I'll just say from the newer graduate side, that was what struck me more than, the tuition is obviously huge, but it's seeing those fees and stuff tacked on, especially things, the whole last year is a clinical year, but paying $300 a semester to use the gym on campus, which I physically can't get to because I'm in a different state or hours away, was kind of just insult to injury. And you can kind of see how the cost can add up with little things like that tacked on over and over again, which again, all that is, like you guys said, outside of the ability of the PT department itself to regulate.
Absolutely. And I kind of want to add one thing here, because I feel like I had a unique opportunity back when I was in school. So our last semester was all clinicals, and our PT director actually had fought for years, every year, to actually have them waive our tuition when we weren't there. And she was actually very successful with that. But she kept saying, I don't know how much longer I can hold them off. But I was really so appreciative that she did that. And I don't know how much that is currently now, but I just remember like, oh my gosh, like that's huge. But, I know we've gone through some of this already. And I know, Alan, you had kind of mentioned earlier that of course there were some limitations to this data, being that had to look at public universities, and then you kind of had a small response rate from what you had kind of mentioned. But from asides what, you guys had already mentioned, what were the results of the research that you found? And obviously accounting for these limitations here, how accurate do you both feel that this data is?
I'll go first, I guess. So when I originally presented this, I never presented it to be, a PhD level research. It was for a project for school. So not as accurate as I would like it to be. As accurate, I think, as we could get it. I think that if somebody else tried to replicate this research, they would run into the exact same barriers. With what struck me the most was the unwillingness of most universities to cooperate. We had to do some Freedom of Information Act requests on a couple universities because they were just unwilling to share the research. They didn't have it publicly posted. It had to be kind of pulled out of them. So just getting the raw data itself was very difficult, which of course then makes the actual number crunching that much more difficult and then less accurate overall. So not a complete picture. The biggest gap in that research was just not having the costs. So a lot of universities looked like they were taking home a lot of revenue from the PT program, but that's just because they didn't have their costs published or weren't willing to share it. And so most of those, they had a big 0 in the cost column just because this unknown variable that we just could not get no matter how hard we fought to get it.
Yeah, from our side, like I said, we don't release any of the data publicly unless we know statistically that it's significant. So like we put out some different things like the average PT debt, different settings. That information actually comes straight from us from our profiles. So like we collect like 740 different data points when somebody builds a profile. And some of that we're triangulating is taking like some of the public information from the tuition, stated tuition versus what's out there, back solving also for undergrad stuff, cost of living, how does it compare to BLS data that we have? So when we sit there and look at the cost of living, when we look at tuition, when we look at income, those are all backed by statistics. But that's also why I've had a lot of requests to publish the data and the stuff that we want to in terms of publishing. It's all backed by statistics. If it's not, we're not publishing it. So on the revenue side, that's the tough thing too, is we could sit there and say, well, how much did you take out for undergrad or for grad school? Because we could see that data. And it's not always the amount that's stated for tuition, just simply because a couple different factors in there. One, people have scholarships and whatnot, so that decreases it a little bit. But then you also got to factor in cost of living adjustments and all that stuff too. And as Alan alluded to with the clinicals, where did the person decide to do clinicals, all that type of stuff, that all adds into that debt load. So it's not exactly apples to apples. So trying to bifurcate and dig through that data, sometimes it can get pretty tedious, but we're collecting more and more. So hopefully we can keep pushing some of that stuff out.
Yeah, awesome. Guys, are there any other resources that you're familiar with that can tell us more about the finances of DPT programs and universities in general, or if someone else wanted to research for themselves?
I have no idea. I wish there was. It would have made that project a lot easier. It was grueling to get even the little bit of data that we had. There's no central repository for that sort of data, even at public institutions where it's supposed to be easily publicly available. It was difficult at times to get that information. I wish it, for whatever reason, it seemed to be a highly guarded secret. A lot of public universities treated that data like a private university would. Even getting line item budgets was even more difficult, trying to see those universities that did share their cost numbers, where did those costs go to? That was even more difficult to get than the revenue or just a general number for cost.
And I'll give you guys a little bit of secret on that. It probably because it doesn't exist. You look at like a public schools stuff. I mean, in order to get that data, you're going to have to go line by line item ledger of how the money flows through the different programs and different sections of the school. And you're never going to get that. I mean, basically all they're going to ever do is basically show one reconciled type of balance sheet or income statement or whatnot, and trying to get the down to the T details is going to be, I mean, I bet you their accounting department, it would take them a month just to sort through all the paperwork and stuff to try to figure out where it's at. Private schools probably a little bit easier because they get audited more often, but with the public schools, it's going to be really difficult to find it. That's why, like when I talk to chairs, they sit there and, their board of regents are the ones that determine all their tuition prices and stuff. And, they're like, look, we're trying to figure out where all this stuff goes to. And, if we can find this information, we'll let you know. It's like, yeah, but just working on that side of the school in the past. Also my dad's company, they sell a lot of stuff to programs. So trying to, I've seen a lot of financial stuff from his company too. And it's like trying to find that data. It's just a minefield, trying to figure out where it all goes. So my opinion, it's just because it doesn't exist. So you're not going to find it. You got to basically take public information, take data that you do have, and try to extrapolate what it means from that, and basically make an inference into a lot of the stuff. And you're not going to get the concrete data.
Wow, that's really, really interesting. I'm just kind of really curious because I know you guys had kind of started this thing. Is anyone else trying to build off the momentum you guys have started to work on this further?
From my end, I'm not that I know of. Alan, I don't know if some of the students that were underneath you are trying to take it and run with it, or are you trying to push anything through ICE? So I'll let you answer that one.
No, not to my knowledge anyone has picked it up. It was pretty time intensive. That was a couple months of data gathering and synthesis for what was a 30-minute presentation at school that we then turned into a blog post and a live video for ICE. But beyond that, I don't know that anybody has picked it up and ran with it. It had some mixed reviews when it hit the airwaves. Some people said that kind of information would destroy PT programs across the country, which obviously didn't happen. But it had some negative reviews, and then it had some people just like to see those numbers and kind of a little bit eye-opening, but I don't know that it opened up anybody's eyes enough to pick up the torch and run with it.
And I get a lot of feedback now, especially too, as our company gotten bigger in the industry and we're doing more workshops at schools and more presentations at SIG events and conferences and all that type of stuff. And a lot of chairs have asked me and sat down with me to go through some of their stuff to figure out what they can do. And a lot of them are just that their hands are tied. I mean, it's just nothing that they can do because it's not the decision and that's made by them. And I mean, I haven't met one chair that is not trying to figure out something because I mean, they got a vested interest in the industry too. So it's like, what can we do here? And at the end of the day, I mean, I know this because I've worked on that university side. I mean, to get just a meeting with the university, anybody, you're talking 3 or 4 months that you got to try to get on the board's agenda, the board of regents. Like it takes 3 or 4 months just to sit down in front of them. And then by the time anything's done, it's 2 years. So, the chairs, they know that. They know they're fighting tooth and nail. So it's like, what all of us all have limited time. So do you spend 100% of your time going on that? Because that's what it's going to take. Or do you say, look, this is out of my hands. I got to provide for my students to give them the best, just the best experience they can have at my school and make sure that they're actually getting the benefit of this, training them, doing all that type of stuff, because that's what I have direct control of. I don't have control of this other stuff.
Right.
So that's where I talk to a lot of the chairs and they're extremely frustrated because it is out of their hands. And at the end of the day, most of them are PTs. So they're not, academics that are coming in managing these programs. They're actual PTs. So they want to see this stuff. They know the ramification on the industry and they're trying to make sure that it doesn't bring it down, but their hands are really tied. So that's the tough part that I see.
Yeah. And Joe, one more follow-up to that, just because if there are any chairs or any faculty members listening and they're like, look, I want to be able to contribute and help my students as best as I can and realize I might not be able to change some things and I know it's kind of apples and oranges here, and it's going to depend on a lot of different factors from the school perspective. But, in general, what are some strategies that you would recommend that faculty members, directors should at least consider, or some steps they should take to help to the best of their ability to work on helping students with managing the finances from their level to what they can control?
Yeah. And this has obviously I want every program in the country to use us. So this might sound really biased, but it doesn't have to be us. It has this is just a general thing that programs and chairs can look at saying, how can we implement some of this stuff? And what I mean by that is when we go to do workshops or whatnot at the different programs, it's not us sitting down explaining dollars and cents to everybody, all these students, that makes them so happy that we're there. It's giving them just the overarching view and general knowledge and saying, look, here's a game plan that you can put together. So that way they don't feel so overwhelmed. I mean, that's at the ultimately, like when I have chairs ask me, what do you guys do in the presentation? It's like, I try to make it so that way, the students aren't overwhelmed when they're graduating because they're looking at this mountain of debt. They have no idea what to do whatsoever. And financial aid just wants to go in and talk about subsidized and unsubsidized loans and whatever that bullshit that doesn't really mean anything. So it's giving them a perspective like, look, you guys can do this. You just need to have a plan, and here's some general information you need to know. That's how you can start planning. And just that sense of, okay, like I get that there's something out there. Like it's a major shift in mindset. And it's like, look, the program is doing something for us to help us instead of just saying, oh, screw you guys. Like there's chairs and there's programs that have basically just flat out told us you're not coming to our school. And we get those students, to call us anyways because they build their profiles and just come on through the internet and they're pissed at the school. Whereas all the other ones that had us come out there that just had a simple plan, they're like, yeah, my school is great. It was awesome. They had you guys come. Like I had a great experience, blah, 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 blah. So we see the shift. So my messaging the chairs is, this is a problem. You don't want your students graduating, basically going on the internet and bad mouthing your school. And I see it all the time in some of these pre-DPT groups on Reddit or the pre-DBT group that Joseph and Casey Coleman have, where it's like, hey, screw that school. Like they don't do shit. Like you don't want that as a chair. So get ahead of this thing and basically have something there to help the students. So there, you could say, look, we know that, this is an issue. We're trying to help you. So I know it's a long-winded answer, but that's the big thing, is just having some type of resource there. Financial aid, I hate to tell you guys this, if you're a chair or faculty listening, financial aid doesn't cut it. Okay. So, there's got to be something different, because if financial aid cut it, you wouldn't have this problem to begin with. And I don't know why they call it financial aid. It's not aid, it's loans. So it's loans. And most of the time, people that are actually giving that loan out don't know anything about the loans. So it's not a financial planning piece to go and send students to. You got to have something else there in place.
Yeah, I think that's really important for the listeners to know, especially because, obviously, like you had said, I remember on our first episode, you told us that one specific story about how one school in particular had the protests and stuff. And I was like, oh my gosh, we do not want that.
Yeah, to add on to that, they didn't make it public, but that school, it wasn't the PT program. It was a higher up in the Board of Regents. They actually just got arrested for embezzlement.
Oh, wow.
So that might've been the reason why they didn't want us to come out there. But anyways, yeah, that was, we've had a few of those, just a handful of programs where the students were actually really pissed off. But
interesting. Huh.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Wow. Interesting. Guys, I want to say first and foremost, again, thank you guys so much for, your insight and the time and being able to share this stuff. Cause I think it was definitely a good discussion to have. And I think it's important to have because, we'll ask you guys our last question in a little bit but ironically, the most common answer to our last question is cost. So we felt it was kind of important to address that. And, Joe, I know you had answered this question last year, but, of course, feel free to give it a go again, saying either you're number 2 or if your opinion has changed, feel free to share that. But here's the question that we ask everyone. If you could change one aspect of healthcare education, whether that be DPT or other healthcare provider related, which aspect would you change and how would you change it? And Alan, let's go with you for this one first.
Man, I hate to even talk about insurance and reimbursement, but I think there's something to be said there about coming out of school and not being paid enough money to make that loan payment. I think if students would know what their loan payment is 3 years after graduation, and I think this is, like Joe was saying, this is something deeper than financial aid coming in and talking about the difference between loans. But if someone came in and said, hey, if you're graduating with 150 grand, your loan payment is going to be 70% of your post-tax take-home pay, I think that would significantly change those students, how they spend over the next 3 years. I think that would, doesn't solve the problem, but indirectly make them more fiscally responsible. Just knowing that it's important to, at least in the model we're operating in now, be as fiscally responsible as we can during school with students and getting them that education on the front end, like Joe was talking about, which will hopefully make them more thrifty and have less of a loan balance coming out at the end. And then kind of that underwhelming pay they start to get, they'll get to keep a little bit more of that than they normally would.
So yeah, you'll like this one, Alan. As a side note, we're actually a lot of the programs are actually having us come out to freshman or first year orientations to actually go through that stuff, including one that you're an alumni of, Alan. So we're starting to get to more and more first years that doing some of that stuff, so that way they could see that and try to take as little loans as they could and whatnot. So that way they could see those payments. But to your question, Brandon, about the one thing that I would like to see, and I don't have the solution to this because I'm just talking about the PT world, and I don't have the solution because I'm not a PT, I'm not, at the programs, but something about the clinicals. We see a lot of kids that go out to clinicals and they underpredict that how much they have to borrow when they start school by about $15,000 to $30,000. Because they don't anticipate having to move for their clinicals, pay dual rents, all that type of stuff. So if we're going to have clinicals in that nature, be more strategic on them and how they're ran. So that way, that piece of the loan, that's something, a lot of the stuff that we talked about, tuition prices, the government with loans, that's all out of the hands of the PT world. The clinicals and the MPT, when you can take the MPT and all that stuff, that is directly in control of the PT world. You guys can do whatever you want to with that. So do something around those two issues, the MPT, when you can take it in clinicals, And personally, if you ask me, again, I'm not a PT, so I can't really say this, but I'm huge on experience. And my thing is get people out of the classroom as fast as possible, because the real world isn't, you sitting down in a room and answering questions for a test. Like, get them trained, get them paid in residencies, whatever it is. Like, get the more hands-on piece, get the academic part out of the way, go hands-on, all that type of stuff. And get them out into the real world and start practicing and go. And again, I talk about that from experience. I mean, everything I've learned more from actually, like, I'm a finance guy. I've learned more from going into investing and, pardon my French, losing my ass on investments than I ever done sitting in front of sitting in a classroom listening to a teacher talk. So I'm huge on experience and getting that out and doing something about clinicals and so on and so forth. So that's where I would go with it.
I was just going to say, I think both of those are really good answers. And I think that's something that needs to be looked at for sure, because we get the big issues right, but I think sometimes there's some little details lost in some of the minutia. And I think if we don't bring those up, they're just never, I mean, it's literally like the Beastie Boys, right? You got to fight for your right to party. Well, if we don't start doing something about insurance and what we're worth and what we're getting reimbursed at, student loans are going to be a much, much bigger issue quicker than ever expected. So, something's got to be done there. But guys, I can't thank you enough for your time and for coming on tonight. Where can our listeners find you guys on social media and online if they have follow-up questions or just want to get in touch and chat?
Yeah, for us, it's just fitbucks.com. If you're a PT, you want help with your loans, just click join now, become a member. It's free. You build your profile, schedule a call. We walk through everything and help you set up a plan. It's all free. If you guys just have a question directly for me, on the bottom is to contact us. It comes to a general information email, and people will send it to me, or you can direct message me on Facebook. Not always the best on Facebook because I travel a lot and the DMs tend to get just bogged down, and I don't know how to use Facebook very well. So emails are easier, but yeah, fitbucks.com is the easiest way. And we respond pretty quickly. So if you have any questions, fitbucks.com, build your profile, or just, contact us and send us an email.
For me personally, I'm on everything is Alan Fredendahl. So Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, I'm pretty easy to find. Probably most active on Instagram, least active on Twitter. I try to avoid Twitter personally these days. It's quite a volatile environment to be in for physical therapy. And then you can reach ICE, every platform at ICE Physio. For Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. So I'm behind those accounts as well. So you can get me either way. And then my email is alan.fredendahl@gmail.com. I'm checking my email all day long, every day. So if you shoot me an email, I will get back to you.
Awesome, guys. Well, again, thank you both so much for your time and insight and coming on. I think this was a very valuable discussion to have and share. But thank you guys for everything.
Yeah, thank you guys.
Hey, thank you guys. Appreciate what you guys do for the PT world with this podcast.
Thank you, man. We try our best. Access to healthcare is one of the largest issues facing both providers and patients, as millions of people worldwide lack timely and affordable access to healthcare. Anywhere Healthcare, a telehealth platform, is a simple, low-cost option for providers and patients that eliminates the barriers to access to all kinds of healthcare. To find out more, check out anywhere.healthcare, which is available in our show notes. And if you use the code HET in all caps when you email to sign up, you'll save 25% off the total cost. Thank you for attending class today, and we hope that you learned something and gained value from the content.
If you'd like to schedule office hours with us, feel free to add us on Twitter at HET Podcast, on Instagram, HET Podcast, on Facebook, the Healthcare Education Transformation Podcast, and the homepage, healthcareeducationtransformationpodcast.com.
And for those of you following along in the syllabus, extra credit can be obtained by liking us, sharing us, and leaving a review.
Let's continue our journey up Mount Educational Success as lifelong learners.